He wasn't supposed to see them again. Not after the court declared him unfit. Not after the woman he once loved vanished into a different life with their children. But fate didn't care for legal papers or lost years. It cared about timing. It cared about the moment Elijah Bennett pushed open the glass door of a pharmacy in San Diego and saw what no court could have predicted. Behind the counter, wearing white coats and gentle smiles, stood three young pharmacists who looked like they had stepped out of an old family photo. Elijah froze. The world blurred a word. His heartbeat slowed, then raced, as his eyes locked on their faces. Blonde hair, green eyes, the unmistakable curve of Jamie's smile, the quiet intensity in Chris's gaze. And Alex, his oldest by minutes, still had that tiny mole just under his collarbone. Elijah used to call it his sunspot. For a moment, he forgot why he came. His blood pressure prescription was meaningless now. What he needed was air, answers, time, but he couldn't move. He stood there, hands trembling at his sides, caught in a memory that had somehow become real. It had been so long since that day, since they were taken from him. Elijah Bennett, once a vibrant painter and devoted father, had lived more than 2 decades in quiet solitude. After coming out as gay in the early 2000s, everything changed. His wife at the time, Rachel, had turned their divorce into a battleground, and Elijah, still reeling from the courage it took to live authentically, lost everything that mattered. He hadn't seen his children since they were toddlers. Not a school photo, not a birthday card, not even a whisper of where they had gone. Only fading memories, replayed like old tapes in his mind. Each night he sat alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, painting things he couldn't say out loud. Now, suddenly, they stood before him, alive, grown, accomplished, and strangers. They didn't flinch when he looked at them, didn't pause in their tasks. Just smiled politely, the way retail workers do to a regular customer. Chris handed a bag to a woman in line. Jamie laughed with a colleague about a typo on a prescription, and Alex glanced up briefly, offering a nod, professional, distant, unaware. They didn't recognize him. Elijah's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words jammed at the edge of his tongue, heavy with too much history. He turned slowly, pretending to browse the pain relievers, unsure if he was about to collapse or scream. He caught one last glimpse, Chris adjusting his name tag, the silver chain around his neck catching the light. Elijah leaned in. The pendant was small, heart-shaped, a birthday gift from him years ago, with the words, "You are loved," etched on the back. His fingers curled into his palm. They were here, they were real. But they didn't know him, and they wouldn't. Not yet, not today. Because for 24 years, someone had made sure they believed their father was dead. Don't miss what happens next in this extraordinary journey of heartbreak, truth, and healing. Follow Heart's story for part 2 and witness a reunion built not by chance, but by courage. Sometimes the most powerful miracles don't arrive with fanfare. They stand quietly behind a counter, unaware that someone just walked in, holding their breath, holding their past, and seeing their future for the first time. Elijah sat alone at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold between his hands. The silence in his small apartment felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. On the table lay an old wooden box. Its hinges creaked when he opened it, revealing the fragile remnants of a life once shared. Inside were drawings, tiny portraits sketched in soft charcoal, each one capturing the round cheeks and shining eyes of 3 children who used to call him Dad. One drawing showed the triplets on their first beach trip, Jamie holding a plastic shovel, Alex squinting into the sun, Chris curled under an umbrella with a book far too big for his age. Tucked underneath the sketches was a folded piece of paper, the sheet music to a lullaby Elijah had written the week they were born, notes scattered across the staves like raindrops, carrying the soft hum he used to sing when rocking them to sleep. He touched the edge of the page, and for a moment the echo of that melody filled the room. But beneath it all, beneath the beauty and the memory, was a jagged wound that never healed. He remembered the night everything unraveled. Rachel had found a letter tucked in his coat pocket. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. She read it once, then again, her face stiffening as the truth settled in. Elijah was gay. What followed was a storm of shouting, slammed doors, and threats. She called him a danger. She said she didn't want her children growing up confused. And when the divorce was finalized, she argued that his presence would harm the kids. She convinced the judge that Elijah's sexuality made him unstable. The court agreed. Full custody went to Rachel. No visitation, no appeals, just absence. And then she vanished. He tried everything, calls to relatives, letters to friends, flyers, police reports. He even hired a private investigator who came back months later with nothing but an apology. In time, the search turned quiet, but the ache didn't. Then came the rumor. A woman he once knew from church mentioned, in passing, that Rachel had told people Elijah had died in a car crash. A vague, offhanded comment, but it explained too much. The silence, the disappearing act, the lack of any trace. He hadn't died. He had been erased. Now, sitting with this knowledge and the memory of his children, standing just feet away behind a pharmacy counter, Elijah knew he had to understand who they'd become. He started quietly. Late nights in his apartment, scanning public records, professional directories, university alumni lists. It didn't take long to confirm what he already knew. Alex was meticulous and quiet. Now a licensed pharmacist applying for graduate scholarships. Jamie, full of light and laughter, had posted an engagement announcement last winter. And Chris Adam, the most introspective of the three, had published short essays in local journals about empathy in medicine. They had grown up, and they had grown well. But not because of him. Elijah learned that he had spent their entire lives with Rachel and a man named Howard, a real estate broker who had been introduced to them as a father figure, not as a replacement, but as if he had always been there. And what stung most wasn't that someone had taken his place. It was that they had never been told there was someone before him. The lies had shaped their childhoods, defined their birthdays, their school dances, their college move-ins. They'd asked no questions because they didn't know there were questions to ask. Elijah ran a hand through his hair, staring at the last drawing he had made of them, three small figures holding hands, walking away from the frame. He had drawn it the day after the custody hearing. And until now, it had felt like prophecy, but something had changed. He had seen them, alive, bright, and unknowingly tethered to a man who still remembered the sound of their infant laughter. What kind of father would he be if he didn't try? Now that he knew where to find them, some truths are painful not because they hurt, but because they were denied. And in the quiet corners of every erased life, there's a chance to be rewritten. Because the greatest cruelty isn't being forgotten. It's being deliberately erased by someone who once claimed to love you. The next morning, Elijah returned to the pharmacy, not out of curiosity, but with quiet resolve. He waited until the lunch hour, when the store was quieter and the fluorescent lights cast a softer glow. He picked up a basket, filled it with items he didn't need, and made his way to the counter where Jamie stood laughing with a coworker. "Back again," she said warmly, scanning his items. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still bright, musical, like the echo of a childhood Elijah remembered all too well. He smiled softly and nodded. "Yeah, I suppose I like the way this place feels." It was a small sentence, meaningless to anyone else, but to Elijah, it was the beginning of something fragile. Over the next few weeks, he returned often. Not enough to draw suspicion, but just enough to be remembered. He asked casual questions, commented on the weather, complimented the pharmacy's efficiency. Each time he watched them, his children move through their day like professionals, like adults. Like strangers with his blood, Jamie was the most open. She always met his gaze, always smiled. Her energy was magnetic, and she often joked with customers or shared small personal stories about her fiancé, a nurse named Daniel. Chris was more guarded. He rarely engaged beyond what was required, But Elijah noticed he stayed late to help elderly patients understand prescriptions. His hands moved with care, his tone always measured, never rushed. Elijah recognized his own quietness in him. Alex, though, was different, focused, watchful. His eyes scanned everything, and though he was polite, he rarely let his guard down. Elijah sensed that if any of them began to feel the weight of unspoken truths, it would be Alex. One afternoon, Elijah stood in line, pretending to read a pamphlet on vitamin supplements. When Chris stepped forward to ring him up, Elijah's gaze dropped, and he froze. Hanging from Chris's neck, glinting in the fluorescent light, was a thin silver chain. Attached to it, a small heart-shaped pendant. It was unmistakable. The same pendant Elijah had given him on their shared birthday, long before the world had shattered. He had it engraved with the words, "You are loved." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He said nothing, only nodded as Chris handed him the receipt. But something shifted in that moment, something internal, intangible. He wasn't just remembering his children, he was witnessing proof that a piece of him had survived in their world. Even if they didn't know it, he started coming not just to see them, but to listen. Jamie talked often about her wedding plans. Chris mentioned his upcoming certification exam and how he was nervous about the practicals. And Alex, while sparing with details, occasionally mentioned grad school applications and late-night study sessions. They spoke to each other in snippets, and Elijah absorbed it all. These weren't children anymore. They were people with dreams, doubts, and lives they built without him. It hurt, of course, but it also healed. Because for years, Elijah had imagined the worst, that they had forgotten him, or worse, resented him. Yet here they were, unknowingly showing him the opposite. The chain around Chris's neck, the empathy in Jamie's voice, the quiet integrity in Alex's eyes. He realized they had grown into themselves not because of the lies, but despite them. Still, the lie lingered. A lie that had shaped their entire worldview. A lie that told them their father was gone. Elijah knew he couldn't stay silent forever. But he also knew that truth, when dropped like a stone, could cause ripples. Sometimes it took more strength to wait than to speak. So he waited, watching, listening, loving them from a distance. Because some reunions aren't built on declarations. They begin with presence, with patience, and with the belief that the truth, when it comes, must not just be heard. It must be felt. In a world that too often asks people to erase what makes them different, Elijah's quiet return held a different lesson: that love doesn't vanish when denied. It finds ways to live, even in disguise, until it can be seen again. Elijah stood across the street from the pharmacy, fingers tightening around a worn envelope. Inside were fragments of a life, once whole photographs of chubby faces pressed against his chest, a copy of each child's birth certificate bearing his signature, and a letter written in shaky penmanship the night before the custody hearing. He had waited long enough. The disguise of a friendly stranger had offered him proximity, but now the weight of silence felt more dangerous than truth. He chose Alex, not just because he was the eldest, but because Alex noticed things. He watched people carefully. He measured words. There was a depth in his stillness that told Elijah if any of them would listen first, it would be him. They met outside the pharmacy during Alex's break. Elijah approached with a calm tone, handing over the envelope as if passing along something forgotten. "I believe you deserve to see these," he said. Alex frowned, hesitating, then accepted the envelope. His eyes scanned the first photo: a man, younger but unmistakably Elijah, cradling 3 toddlers with sleepy smiles. Next, the birth certificates, then the letter. He didn't say anything for a long time. Elijah stood quietly beside him, giving space for disbelief, for calculation, for the gut punch of a memory returning uninvited. Finally, Alex looked up. "Who are you?" "I'm your father," Elijah said, a voice barely above a whisper. "Not by metaphor, not by hope, by blood, and by choice." Alex's face tightened. "You're dead," he said, more to himself than to Elijah. You died in a crash. Mom told us. She was wrong, Elijah replied, gently. Or she wanted you to believe she was right. That night, Alex didn't go home. Instead, he drove to the edge of the city and parked near a quiet overlook. The documents spread across the dashboard. His mind raced through birthdays, bedtime stories he didn't remember, questions he'd never thought to ask. He called Rachel the next morning. She didn't deny it. She didn't cry. She simply said, "I did what I had to do. I didn't want you growing up ashamed. The world's cruel enough already without having a gay father added to the list." Alex hung up. No fury, no screaming, just a numb realization his childhood had been curated, not lived. That afternoon, he returned to the pharmacy, waited until Jamie and Chris were on break. Then he sat them down in the employee lounge, his hands shaking as he laid out the truth, the photos, the letters, the dates. At first, Jamie laughed in disbelief. Chris went pale. They both asked the same question, why? But even as their voices rose, none of it could erase the facts now staring them in the face. The silver chain, the lullaby Jamie remembered humming but didn't know the origin of. Chris's habit of tapping 3 fingers on the table when nervous, a rhythm Elijah used to play on their backs as infants to soothe them to sleep. In that small, staff-only room filled with vending machines and fluorescent lights, their world fractured and began to reshape. Alex called Elijah that evening. His voice was hoarse but steady. "We need to talk," he said. "All 3 of us." It wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration. Because truth doesn't wait for perfect timing. It arrives when the cost of silence outweighs the chaos of confrontation. When they met again, this time outside the pharmacy after closing, there were no hugs, no tears. Just 3 young adults staring at a man who had been buried alive in memory, now standing flesh and bone in front of them. Elijah didn't beg. He didn't apologize for truths he never got to speak. He just stood there, steady. Jamie was the first to break. "You didn't just disappear," she said. "You were erased." And for the first time in years, Elijah felt seen, because acknowledgement is the first thread in repairing something torn. The lesson that night wasn't about blame. It was about the long shadow of fear and how adults sometimes make choices out of panic that rob children of the fullness of truth. But even then, the truth waits. And when it returns, it asks not for vengeance, it asks for courage. The first time Elijah stood before them, not as a stranger, not as a memory, but as the living man who gave them life, was in the back lot of the pharmacy just after dusk. The city was quiet, the last light of the sun softening the sharp corners of concrete and glass. Chris leaned against the brick wall, arms crossed. Jamie paced, her heels clicking with nervous energy. Alex stood still, hands in pockets, his eyes never leaving Elijah's face. No one spoke right away. And yet, in the silence, something sacred was being rebuilt. This time, Elijah didn't need to explain everything. The truth had done its work. The rest would come with time. What followed wasn't sudden forgiveness or dramatic embraces. It was slower, quieter, real. Jamie was the first to reach out, literally and emotionally. She asked Elijah to meet her fiancé. She wanted him to come to the wedding, not as a guest, but as her father. Chris remained distant for a while. He asked questions, some hard, some soft. He needed proof not just of biology, but of intent. Elijah answered everything with patience, never rushing. It was Chris who eventually found the lullaby Elijah had written, tucked into an old music box Rachel had forgotten to hide. The melody matched the one he sometimes heard in his dreams. Alex, ever the protector, took the longest, but he watched. He saw how Elijah showed up, not to demand, but to offer. And slowly he allowed himself to believe that perhaps they hadn't been fatherless after all, just misled. Weeks turned into months. Conversations deepened. Memories surfaced. One spring afternoon, Jamie proposed something unusual. Behind the pharmacy, In a small gravel plot where employees took their breaks, she suggested they plant something permanent, something that would grow with them. They chose an olive tree, symbol of peace, of longevity, of restoration. Elijah brought the sapling, Chris brought the tools, Jamie brought a plaque, and Alex, he brought his siblings together, quietly, steadily, like the quiet root system of the tree itself. They dug into the earth with bare hands, pressing soil over roots as the wind stirred around them. Elijah didn't cry. He just knelt beside them, letting the dirt cling to his palms. It was the first time since the custody ruling that all four of them had done something together. No legal document could undo the lost years, but no lie could stop this moment from growing. 12 months later, the pharmacy held a celebration for its 25th year. Balloons floated at the storefront, customers filled the aisles, employees gathered for photos. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, hesitant, until he saw them, Alex, Jamie, and Chris walking toward him with a birthday cake in hand. They had planned it in secret, a shared birthday, just like when they were little. Jamie nudged Chris. He cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, holding out the knife. "You cut first." Elijah's hands trembled, not because of the cake, but because of the word. The first time they had called him that in front of other people. Not a whisper, not in private, but loud, clear, and proud. In that moment, surrounded by frosting, candles, and laughter, Elijah felt something he hadn't touched in over 2 decades. Belonging, because the truth, once buried, had finally been replanted. And this time, it was allowed to bloom. For any mom who has ever lost time with someone they love, for any parent erased by silence or shame, this story is proof that truth does not expire. It waits for courage, for reunion, for love to try again. So let me ask you, if you found out someone erased your past to protect you, would you forgive them? Or confront them? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Heart Story for more powerful true stories about truth, identity, and second chances.